must constantly look at things in a different way.
The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast was created by two physical therapists out of the desire to learn more about the different educational roles in physical therapy and healthcare, and how healthcare education works by talking with educational leaders and people with different perspectives within physical therapy and across interdisciplinary lines on how education can be improved to disrupt the status quo of healthcare education. This is our journey, and thanks for listening. Are you a third-year physical therapy student that excels on tests when you have study guides, checklists, and deadlines? With all of the information available about how to prepare for the NPTE, it's easy to get disorganized and not feel prepared going into the big day. NPTE Prep Success is an online course that provides PT students easy-to-use study guides and step-by-step guidance through the NPTE preparation. To learn more, visit kylericeprep.com. Thank you again all for your continued support. And now for the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. My name is Brandon Powen, and for this episode, I'm actually flying solo. As for those listening for the first time, each of the hosts of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast independently do their own podcast miniseries on a subject matter that they each desire to learn more about and contribute to. And my particular topic of interest is DPT clinical education advancement, post-professional education path for PT. And part one of my series is actually in the show notes as we interviewed Gail Jensen, Bob Rowe, and John Childs. As today, the focus of discussion is on the Education Leadership Partnership, or also called the ELP, which has the mission of reducing unwarranted variation in practice by focusing on best practices in education. As today, I am thrilled to welcome three members from the ELP, and they are Herr, Zoher Kapasi, and Laurie Kontney. Now, all, thank you so much for coming on today, and I really appreciate your time and all your service to the profession. But let's dive right into this topic of the ELP. So Roger, with you being the inaugural chair of the ELP and the chair of the task force that recommended the establishment of this partnership, would you mind telling our listeners about kind of how the ELP was formed back in 2016 to give some background on this?
Thank you. Yes, as you mentioned, the task force that both Zoher and I were involved with APTA Board of Directors, was the kickoff for some recommendations. And those recommendations sort of say we need to work together, and who are the key stakeholder groups within physical therapist education to begin that process. And that's where working with, at the time, the Section on Education and ACAP, the American Council of Academic Physical Therapy. And the reason for bringing these groups together was we all had very strong interest in physical therapy education. However, we were very siloed in our approaches. And the landscape had changed. The role of APTA in education and the emergence of ACAP from the Section on Education, we had different organizations to work with. So getting those organizations together was the reason for forming ELP, or the Education Leadership Partnership. A great idea. Now, figuring out how these three strong groups work together was really our first year activity. And our cause that you identified earlier in reducing unwarranted variation in practice through best practices in education was, I think, our major milestone that we all came to agreement. It sounds like a simple statement, but for all of us to say, this is what we agree on, and how we approach our work is different, and recognizing that. So that was a key milestone in our first year work. And then we began looking at what is each of us doing, and how and where do we collaborate, and where do we respect the work of each of those organizations. And that was our first year of work before we then started thinking about, well, what direction do we need to go from the work we're doing? And I think you saw that in the second year of work that probably Zoher will talk about in the best practice in clinical education, and how we did town halls and some other things. Also with the House of Delegates working on the reimbursement or the cost of education and the resources to both students in loan and awareness in debt. And how to and what they're incurring in their education. So those are just a couple examples of the work, but as I point out in that first year.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to kind of gain some perspective on that. And I know that, as you said before, you had mentioned a couple of the things that ELP has been working on, primarily, of course, first with trying to really start and figure out how to work together efficiently between
all these big players from all these different organizations and kind of some of the other issues that you had recommended. So I know within that you guys had mentioned that you were specifically kind of working on some of these issues, but what are some of the other issues, perhaps that you didn't mention before, Roger, that the ELP has been working on since its implementation, and what progress has been made thus far in regards to that? And Roger, we'll start with you and then follow up with Laurie and then Zoher following that, if that's cool.
What it did was generate a great conversation and awareness on an issue that is complex. And so there's no easy answer, and people are looking for an answer. So where we're trying to go is, what do we need for the current and future world of practice? We have some models that have existed and served us well for decades, but does that prepare us for all the changes in the healthcare environment and where physical therapists may practice in the future? So with that, are we going to be generalists and are we going to be specialists was one critical question that polarized people, but the point is they were engaged and they had opinions on that. But what does best prepare us to enter the workforce now and in the future? So those are some examples where there was much discussion on many listservs. We had town halls. ELP convened a subgroup to say, hey, we three organizations need to outreach and work with employers, with clinical people in clinical practice, people overseeing the education model in clinical practice. And that was a 3-month process for that outreach, which culminated in feedback to ELP. It gave us a lot of feedback of where we had some alignment and where we had some division of opinions, and we need to figure out how to work through that. Did it give us all the answers? No, but it gave us a lot of information of where we need to work, which stakeholders were most concerned on which issues, and that then helps us figure out, so how do we have the conversations to resolve those issues? So that's kind of another example of the last year, but I'll turn it over to the others.
So building on what Roger had talked about, when the Excellence in Education Task Force did make recommendations, and one of those was to pull out the clinical education piece, and thus the best practice of clinical education task force. In consideration of those two groups, the ELP early on decided that educational research was a critical piece that needed across all aspects of education, both pre, during, and post, both academic and the clinical environment. And they convened a educational research strategy work group and strategic planning meeting that was extremely successful and brought forth a lot of fruit that got us on the track for looking at how to structure, how to conduct, and how to better do educational research to support our decision making. I bring that piece up because now looking at the clinical education piece, we are conducting a similar strategic planning meeting this October that will allow us to look into and strategize for the future for clinical education as well. So I think some of the things that we've accomplished in a short amount of time have really been considerable as far as trying to make sure we lay the foundation for decision making based on research and data points that are critical. So I'll turn it over to Zoher as well.
Yeah, so I'll just build on what Roger and Laurie said. If you look at the recommendations, Brandon, from both the task force, I mean, we found that there was a considerable overlap, which actually makes sense because, this whole concept of didactic education and clinical education, it's not dichotomous. We try to sort of put it into different buckets, so to speak, but really it's all integrated, right? So when we looked at the recommendations from both task force, there was considerable overlap. Both the task force talked about the fact of doing more research related to education that can help us inform our decisions, not only about our didactic education, but also the clinical education. We also talked about resources we would need that would be common for both groups. We talked about outcomes that we were looking from the didactic and the clinical education part. And of course, the academic clinical partnerships. I mean, that is universal. That's something spans across all aspects of education. So when we realized that there was this overlap, we decided to do strategy meetings around each of these core concepts. And we wanted both the didactic and the clinical education integrated. We didn't want separate silos for that. So as Laurie pointed out, in January of 2017, we had this whole retreat on the education research strategy. And that was extremely successful. And we looked at all the components, like, for example, what resources we would need, what kind of partnerships, who the players will be. Now, in October of this year, next month, as a matter of fact, we're doing a clinical education strategy session. Again, the clinicians will be distributed across resources, education research agenda, academic clinical partnerships, outcomes, so that clinical education is infused across all of these buckets. And then in 2019, we will tackle with outcomes and resources. In 2020, we will tackle with the academic clinical partnerships. In other words, we're trying to bring both aspects of education together because there are commonalities to both. We need resources, we need data and research to guide both these activities. And clearly the academic clinic partnerships I talked about is something that's integral to all of this. So that's what we've done. And I think, as Laurie said, we feel that we've accomplished a lot and we're really excited about the future.
In our first year, Laurie and Zoher identified some of the initiatives that moved forward, but we developed half a dozen focus groups of our work to begin discussions and figure out which issues should move forward, such as the educational research agenda or the other areas. But some of those foundational areas that didn't have a clear-cut action but needed discussion to figure out how we organize include the data management of how do we work with all the different data on education that is very siloed within the different systems, and how do we use that? And then what other data do we need, which was part of the educational research agenda, but it's foundational to all of our work, not just research. And other areas include the essential resources in a program and in educational programs, faculty development. And we also had some work that was identified by the task force of outcomes competencies and what that might look like in the future, getting away from the very task-based or process-based activities that we see in the traditional practicum environment to more global traits and behaviors that we would look at within the practitioner, but also what are some of those innate skills that someone should have before they enter the clinical formal professional education, and can we begin to work with that earlier and identify those trends and get people aware and involved in education earlier than the application process.
I really like what you had kind of all said in there in terms of the stuff you guys have been working on. So let's dive in a little bit kind of to some of these specific topics here, just to kind of see what you guys have learned and kind of where we stand overall. So let's start off with education research. I know that's something that you guys had mentioned earlier. So Laurie, do you think you could tell the listeners a little bit about kind of what the ELP has learned about and kind of the status regarding education research from your guys' point of view?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, we realize that there is a paucity in the research as it relates to educational research, as well as a lack of, or at least what we might consider insufficient funding for educational research. And we really felt it was critical that not only do we need to get ourselves out there and be more engaged and involved in the educational research realm, but we also need to be able to train our scientists, our clinicians, our academicians in how to best partner and conduct this critical educational research. And I believe one of the greatest things that came out of the educational research strategy group was that we have now been conducting very successfully MERC workshops, which are medical education research certificates for our clinicians, and even greater, this last month, we convened a GAMER, which is Grantmanship and Mentorship in Education Research. It was an inaugural event where seasoned scientists and educational researchers were able to mentor and help persons that were very maybe engaged in educational research, but actually trying to just help them sort of step up their game and really mentor them and engage them through the process, so that they would have much better success in securing funding, taking it to the next level, and really being able to put some data to the path that we want to go towards with improving education across the curriculum. So I think we've done some great things in that arena, but I also, we've done so much that it's hard to fathom what this group has accomplished in such a short time. So I'm not sure how familiar the group is with the concept of entrustable professional activities, or EPAs. It comes from the pharmacy, the medical world, at looking at basic competencies for the clinical education piece. However, we've had some big leaders within our own profession that have been taking that on, and we have conducted seminars, we've published articles, we continue to do town hall focus groups at our main meetings, looking and trying to gather as much stakeholder feedback and get the information out there, and whether it's time for our profession to look at some competency-based educational pieces that would determine readiness for entry into the clinical education realm. So I think we've accomplished a lot, and I'll let some of my other colleagues here talk about other aspects of where we're going with this educational research and laying the foundation.
Yeah, I can chime in. I think one of the things we realized very earlier on is that we need to train our folks in how to go about educational research. We need to build a cadre of researchers. So to that extent, I think what Laurie just mentioned, these MERC workshops, which really AAMC started for the medical profession, we've been able to bring it to our forums at CSM and Education Leadership Conference, etc., for our folks to get trained in some of the research methods related to education. But we've gone a step further, and she talked about the gamer workshop, where we can take folks and mentor them into education research and build a cadre of researchers that would really help us propel our our entire profession forward, so that we are guided in all the decisions we make related to education, both didactic and clinical education, with some data that can guide us in terms of best practices. So, this is really an important piece, and we're really excited how we've gotten it started, and we've gotten good support from different partners as well.
Yeah, I think those are some really good points, everyone. And I think that definitely brings some clarity on the education research component, because we had actually the chair of the ACAP's Graduate Outcomes Task Force, Lisa Dorsey, on not too long ago to talk about this. And she had mentioned about EPAs and kind of where the board standed at that point, and how at that point, really to advance, she said they were waiting for the final charge from ACAP to come down, because ACAP was still synthesizing all the other data from all the other task force yet. So that's kind of as she said, kind of like a holding pattern, as we say, which makes sense. But so let's dive into kind of another topic that you guys said was kind of important to kind of that the ELP was working on. So this idea of having a strong partnership between the practice side and the academic side. So Zoher, do you mind starting us off with that and kind of going through kind of where the ELP has gone specifically and what has been learned regarding that issue?
Yeah, I'm happy to. If you look at the entire clinical education model, nothing has changed over the last 60 years, or I should say most of it has not changed. And, being in academia, we always view sort of the clinical education faculty as something separate from the academic faculty, when really that should not be the case. And I think there's a greater recognition across the board in academia that our clinical education instructors are part of us, and they're an extension of the academy. So to that extent, I think, some of us have pursued giving them faculty appointments within academia, bringing them to some of the education leadership conferences, sponsoring some of our clinical instructors to accompany us. Those are activities that are happening, but we want to sort of really take this next step forward. So as you know, as we've developed different task forces and as we've engaged in our work within ELP2, we've invited folks from different systems to help us. We have representatives from the VA system sitting at ELP, from private practice groups, etc., so that we have their feedback as we develop different initiatives. And they're, even in our different strategy group meetings, we have strong representation of clinicians and clinical instructors as we deliberate. So, it's not something that education happens at the ivory tower level and it's totally devoid of what's going on in the clinic. We're trying to truly integrate both entities together. This is one of my personal pet peeves, because I'm in academia and, I've been part of large academic health centers. And when you look at our counterparts in the medical world, in the MD programs, our healthcare systems would not think of recruiting MDs without giving them concomitant appointment in School of Medicine. That's not the case. I mean, our healthcare system hires PTs, but they have no relation to the programs that are already housed in that academic medical center. Now, that's also changing, so I shouldn't be, broad in the way I categorize this, but you get the idea that, sometimes they're kind of separated from the academic programs, and we just feel that that shouldn't be the case, but there should be a smooth integration because, both didactic and clinical education occurs on a continuum. It's not discrete entities that sometimes I think comes across. So we are making efforts in kind of getting more and more feedback from our clinical education partners in all the activities that we do.
Speaking from the perspective of a director of clinical education, I know that when I have a good, strong clinical academic partnership with an entity, be it a private practice, be it a health system or a small rural access hospital or a home health agency, and regardless of geography or where they're located, I know that I'm going to have the best experience for my students because I have a good relationship. We're all on the same page as far as where those students are, what to expect of those students, how to mentor those students. There's a relationship there. So that's what we're striving for. And the downside of that is there are some factors within our educational environment that do make the clinical education piece more challenging with the number of programs and students and time that students need to be out in the clinic, that I feel like some programs, including myself at times, are just trying to survive and get the clinical sites so our students can have the experiences. And yes, we do everything we can to make sure those experiences are ideal, that we have communication. But I, for one, can validate from my 26 years as a DCE that when you have that relationship, that ongoing tightness with a site where you are on the same page and you are working closely together and you are supporting each other, that it's just better. And that's where we need to go. And I think talking about the academic clinical partnerships is critical. And ELP has certainly worked to integrate multiple stakeholders and community members into our work, both at the board level as members that are not necessarily voting but are attending our meetings, as well as in our subgroup work and in our strategic planning meetings, to make sure that we are looking at those partnerships. So just wanted to give a personal example of how I know partnerships are critical to outcomes, and we need to take it to a bigger global scale.
Laurie, let's dive in a little bit more about another issue that's kind of been talked or kind of focused on within the ELP, and that's the clinical education curriculum. So where do we stand overall on that?
Well, it's a mixed bag. You have some people that say, if it's broke, don't fix it. And you have others that say, well, it is broken. And is it the clinical side? Is it the education side? Is it practice? I mean, there's just so many things out there that we don't have the data points for that we need. But as both Roger and Zoher have alluded to, is the ClinEd piece is really integrated throughout all of what we do in education. So whether it's clinical education that occurs as an integrated piece, or whether it's the terminal clinical internships, or whether it's post-professional, the bottom line is we need to look at and how those academic and clinical partners communicate, how they work together, and how we improve that. And we can't just say we're not going to do anything with it. I think we need to look at all those aspects. But as I was preparing for this, I was thinking of how even the credentialed clinical instructor program has revised. It's used to be called the Advanced Clinical Instructor Workshop, and now it's just level 2. But it is all about structuring the clinical education experience. So much like a syllabus for my course, it's a syllabus for the clinical education piece. So to me, that is a really nice move towards looking at an actual clinical education curriculum. It feeds into what Roger was talking about, as well as what would be basic competencies that students should possess at different points throughout their educational experience. So I'm looking forward to the task force strategy group meeting that we will be having at APTA at the end of October to see how we are going to structure our agenda for future steps in research research and initiatives in clinical education, but I really believe that we have to start with, we have to have a clinical education curriculum. It just can't be haphazard sending them out, because it makes it harder to get good outcomes when our clinical instructors don't know what to expect and when our students don't know what to expect. So I think that having a curriculum will do wonders for advancing efficiency in what we're doing in the clinic, as well as producing the best outcome and the best clinician that we can produce.
Yes, this has been a really rich discussion, and a lot of people are interested in this, which is great. As Zoher identified, a strong interest to academic programs to really take the lead in that bridge, and that clinical education is part of education, and partnering with the communities that is, the practitioners, the employers, et cetera, and recognizing there's some changes in those markets and what employers expect. Also on a clinical end and also on a fiscal end. And that relationship is causing some changes that weren't there before. What we've seen is the variation, and that goes back to our core and why this is so critical to our work. There are people who have phenomenal experiences, and there are people that have less than par experiences or subpar. And that variation is frustrating to everyone, to the student, to the practice, to the program, et cetera. So while we don't have the best practices all identified, and that's part of where we're trying to go, we realize there's no one path at this point, and there's no one perfect model for clinical education that's been identified, but we need to keep pushing to identify what are the pieces of best practice, what are the global outcomes we're trying to go to reduce the variation, the unwarranted variation in that. And that there is no one way. Another area that was very clear in this work is that this work in clinical education and the partnership is that this is not specific to PT. This is an issue for both PT and PTA, and that is part of the work there that we all face in that work. So we've had a subgroup on PTA in the ELP. However, this is one where the work is clearly integrated, and we can learn and help across the profession.
I think that's really important to really get us stakeholder, because especially knowing that, I mean, obviously we're still trying to learn and figure out what's the best way to advance, and there's no one right answer. So I really do think that's important to consider for the audience, is that really starting to work and really focusing on trying to find these next steps to kind of make it better and really reduce that variance. That's huge. So we've talked a lot about some of the entry level stuff here, but let's switch gears here a little bit and let's talk about maybe some post-professional education stuff. So what is the ELP's long-term strategic plan for professional and post-professional education? And Roger, I'd like to start with you for this one, and then others can kind of chime in after that if they'd like.
I know that you've spoken directly with Bob Rowe, and he has a very strong vision for that, both in his board role and in his work within the profession, which I greatly admire. However, we have some thought leaders, but we've not had a professional association-wide agreement on that. We see some opportunities in that, and in the result of specialization in other areas. But this is not yet matured. We have not yet agreed on this, but we need to force the conversation and not ignore it. And that is my perspective. So is there an end goal? The end goal is to have the conversation to figure out where we all want to go together, and how are we going to do that, and who's going to lead it, who's going to support it, and determining that. So while we will look to the thought leaders out there and bring them in and say, give us direction, and then with our resources and all of our different memberships, subgroups, et cetera, is getting input and the practicality, the issues, the concerns, the finance, all the other resources that it would take to pursue that. So we don't have a clear end game of a result. We need to determine that and agree on it.
But I think it's really important that at least, plans are being made to really address that and really start that. Because I think, like you said, there's a lot of barriers and there's a lot of things going on that can kind of really have an impact on that. So I think that's a really, really good first step. So let's switch up a little bit then, and kind of, I know you guys earlier had talked about looking more at outcomes and resources in the near future, but apart from that, or if we want to expand on that, that's fine. But what is the ELP looking to do next to investigate further, to address some of the other task force recommendations, and to kind of uphold its core value of kind of reducing unwanted variation within education? And Laurie, let's start with you for this one.
kind of building on what we've already been talking about is the ELP has multiple subgroups that are looking at those recommendations that consist of ELP members as well as community stakeholders, CAPD, the clinical specialists, all of these different stakeholders looking at how we can address these different subgroups. However, I think the most important thing that we've done is we've realized that we still need to have a strategic plan for each of those subgroup areas. So what we are doing as a group is, while we're addressing the ongoing issues that come before us and trying to, for instance, we've had a group on student debt that's been really important with trying to look at that issue with PTA education and not just trying to, it's not just PT like Roger had said, we have to look at the impact with both, but these strategic planning workshops. So again, I know you've heard about educational research. We're doing clinical education this October. And Zoher had also mentioned that for next year, we are specifically going to do a strategic planning work group for outcomes and essential resources. And then in the following year with academic and clinical partnerships. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not working on those ongoing, but we have a vision and a plan. And as Roger had talked about, it's not easy. There's no one answer. And we need the data points. We need the bigger minds to help us understand how to get where we need to go. So it's not something that's just going to happen overnight, but we have looked at a long-term plan. We have looked at how strategically we can continue to build our knowledge and planning within these different recommendation areas so that hopefully within the next 2 years, we really have a plan moving forward that we've not only have a plan, but we've been working on initiatives to help us be able to identify some of the factors that cause us to have these variations, factors that cause us to have less than ideal internship experiences, and not just in entry-level education, but also in post-professional. So I think it's really important that we have a strategic plan and that we realize these things can't just get done in a day or a week or a month or a year, but it is a long-term vision. And we're better together, working together, and I think we'll get there.
So, kind of from your perspectives here, from working within an organization and kind of working as a group within the ELP, what are some of the barriers that the ELP faces that a regular PT may not be aware of, and what has been currently done to adapt to some of these barriers? And Zoher, let's start with you for this one.
I don't know if barrier is a word for it, or maybe a strong word perhaps, but I do feel that we do need a broad engagement from all aspects of our profession. And, people still don't know what ELP is. So I think we deal with that fact that people are not aware of all the stuff that we are doing. So, a podcast like yours is a great step in that direction, and we appreciate you doing this. It's a great service. So, the thing I would say is, in terms of quote unquote barrier would be that we would like more and more of our membership to get engaged in all the initiatives we are doing. The second thing also we have to recognize is that we are a voluntary group. It's a voluntary organization. Each of us has, jobs, daytime jobs that keeps us very busy. So the more folks can get engaged, I think it will help propel our work even more. So, but having said that, I do feel that there is an excitement. I think people want to be engaged. People are getting involved. And again, just you reaching out to us and wanting to do a podcast, I think we're already getting traction in terms of what ELP is all about. I'll let others chime in.
Yes, I think from what I've seen, there are some barriers to describe them are really the lack of understanding of the global processes. An example is we can look at education, but also the impact on licensure within the state. Those are some of the challenges that are separate, but to a clinician in their day-to-day clinical practice, they're integrated. They have their education, they have their licensure, et cetera, and realizing that may be a challenge there. Also, the processes and systems. I've learned a lot in this partnership about the educational organization, and that a PT or PTA program is within an academic institution, and sometimes those are part of state systems that have their rules, systems, and processes. And I know we've learned this in the moving from to the DPT, that those are some of the challenges to implement some good ideas, but I've really learned the impact of that. And there might be other drivers in those organizations from whether it's other disciplines or from state budgets or research agendas, et cetera, that are different than what we're focusing on in the PT education realm. And also some of the things like the student loan forgiveness programs and who is eligible and what degrees are eligible for that, and learning some of the qualifications that serve some of our members, not all of our members. So those are some things that we have good ideas, but we don't fit within those larger systems, whether it's state-based, educational-based, government-based, et cetera.
Yeah, and just even going back to basics, I think, we live in a society where everybody wants instant change, and people don't always necessarily know what the other side of the issue or the discussion is. And we have people that feel very strongly about some things and others, and they don't realize necessarily what the bigger vision is, and that immediate change isn't always possible, especially when you're talking about such complex issues. So I think those are some of the barriers that we deal with, because we'd like to have these things done more quickly, but there's also barriers of budgeting and time and people being able to come together and what it takes to get people together. And so there's a lot going on. However, I think sometimes we tend to be impatient and want things more quickly, and they don't realize all the planning and everything that goes on behind the scene to make these things work. So I think as a group, we've learned how to work with each other really well, and how we all contribute and do things that help advance us as a group, which is fantastic. But I think that we have to manage expectations as well, and that can be a challenge.
Well, absolutely. But I think it's really good to kind of get those barriers and things out front there, because honestly, at the end of the day, I know Zoher and Roger, everyone had kind of mentioned that there are so many moving parts, so many things that have to be done on top of also doing life and other day jobs. And then, of course, as an organization, there are other things involved in the mix that, might make it harder to achieve. So I think it's good that we have awareness of those things, because then people can understand this is the reality of how this has to work. This was why, it's not going to happen tomorrow, to Laurie's point. So I think that's very important. And Laurie, I know you'd kind of mentioned a little bit on some of the budgeting stuff. Roger, do you mind just giving us a brief overview of how is the ELP funded?
Great question. And yes, everyone is curious about money. We each as partners have our own budgets, and we each bring that to the work. And we agreed early on that we're not putting all the money on the table and dividing it differently. We are each managing our own budgets and continue to do so. However, we agree on what are the priorities and what are the projects that we're each doing, and where are we working together? Where are we staging our work, as compared to everyone gets at a good idea and does their piece of it, but the pieces don't fit together, or they're not in the right sequence, or they don't build upon the work. So that's where the conversations happen, to understand, oh, you guys are doing this? Okay, we'll wait for that until we do this. Or, oh, that's going to collaborate with us here. But the money it was a big issue in the beginning to clarify that, because we all have finite resources. However, I think our best resource are the people. And I divide that in both the volunteers. We each bring subject matter experts within our communities that the others don't know of, and bringing them together, such as the Best Practice in Clinical Education Task Force, or what we're doing this year, is the ELP members are a subset of who's participating in these summits. It's bringing in all the people we know who are the thought leaders to then figure out what we do with this information. So that volunteer information is critical. Also, the staff. The staff are the glue that holds all our work together, organizing this podcast, et cetera. They are critical, and we each have staff, but coordinating that, and that has been a critical element to our success. And also our ability to add other members, the non-voting members, such as CAPTI, the clinical education community, et cetera. The knowledge and the resources is the people are far greater value than the money, and we've agreed on the money so we can focus on doing the work. So the funding to me is, who's paying for those salaries and the staff? That's to me more important than the money we're spending on the work, because once we identify the work, it gets done. The summit happens. We make it happen. So that's to me where we've gone, but we did focus on money that first year a lot.
Well, and that really makes a lot of sense. And I really like that perspective, because especially, it's people that really end up propelling stuff forward. I mean, yes, there is money that's needed to a point to get stuff started, but like you said, I think the staff part is so critical. And you had mentioned before CAPD and a couple other things in that previous answer, Roger, but what are some of the other boards, organizations that are also contributing to improving the clinical education dilemma that are maybe outside of the ELP necessarily?
Most definitely. As I was preparing, I was like making a list, and it's like pretty impressive, the groups that we have engaged within our work. And, we have obviously our partnership organizations, but we also have the American Board of Physical Therapy Residency and Fellowship Education, Physical Therapy Specialties. We have the Credentialed Clinical Instructor Program. We have the Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy and CAPD. We have input from interprofessional education groups. And even within our own organizations, the Academy of Physical Therapy Education has a education special interest group, and the ACAP has a national consortium of clinical educators. So all of these groups, in addition to our community partners, looking at healthcare organizations, have all been really important stakeholders that Roger had talked about, our content experts, both academic, clinical, and organizational, along with our APTA staff and their expertise, have all been included and strongly encouraged and engaged within this process in this group. So I'm really proud of that because I think it does give us a broad perspective.
Absolutely. And I think it's really good to know how many different moving parts and how many other organizations are collaborating on this. I would just imagine the hard part is actually coming together and collaborating, get everyone on the same page to get the best way forward. So I think that would probably be the harder part. But, you guys had mentioned before that, of course, as the ELP is gaining traction, there's more stuff that's being done with it and such, and there's more stuff that you guys have been able to do. From the ELT standpoint, how can just a regular student, clinician, faculty member help contribute to these problems of clinical education, along with the work that's being done in the ELP to help contribute to advancing some of these issues?
Well, I can start, Brandon. I think awareness is the biggest thing. I think if folks can stay engaged and, chime in. I mean, we are a profession, and I feel like it starts even with the students, trying to stay engaged with different things that are going on. In fact, I'm proud that, many of our organizations do involve students to at least be part of some of our deliberations so they can know what's going on and really prepare them to take on the leadership roles for the future. So I would say engagement would be the biggest thing, that people should stay engaged and get interested and see all the stuff that's happening. Again, as I've alluded earlier, podcasts like yours, getting the word out so that people know what's happening, I think that would be the biggest benefit. Ultimately, it really is about a profession. And so while we all have our day jobs, no profession can grow if the membership is not engaged. It's more than a job. And I think that's the mentality we all need to sort of have straight in our heads as to where we need to go.
Yeah, so I think while ELP has had some specific surveys and outreach activities, I think the day-to-day clinician, student, et cetera, should be engaged in their components, whether it's the PTA caucus, the student assembly, their community within APTA, and through them, identify the concerns and the issues, because that is how we communicate with our various components. So if they're not directly involved with ELP, those are the ways to express your voice and concern. And I think we'll hear them through our collaboration in our projects. So they don't have to do anything extra unless they see an opportunity or a call that they're very interested in, but to keep engaged in their components and with their faculty, with their other communities that they may be working in. And that would help us keep up to date and understand the issues as they come up.
I think that's a really important point. And, for perhaps some of the listeners, of course, as well, that maybe want to look into this more, of course, we can recommend the ELP website through APTA, which will be in the show notes, of course. Are there any other resources that you guys would recommend to the listeners or stuff if they wanted, again, find out more about some of these issues? Like, what would be some other good places for them to look up for resources to learn more?
Well, I would say definitely start with the ELP website, because you have at least information on who's involved, who's on that ELP, so that they can reach out as needed. I think I was really pleased with when the news release came out, the PT News in Motion back on May 8th, that there already really quickly were a lot of responses to that, with people like, oh, I'm really glad this is happening and that you're out there. And I think raising our awareness is great, but if people want to know what some of the issues are, they can start with talking to us, reaching out to us, and certainly making sure that they're informed and that they have the resources to understand how and why our processes are the way they are and what we're looking at and working on. So we've been very transparent in getting our work out there, and we're always happy to talk to people. So just thank you again for this podcast, which will hopefully reach even more people so that they do reach out to us and we can continue to grow our awareness of the issues that are out there.
Brandon, the other couple of resources, if I may add, the APA website clearly, but also I know the section on education, APTI has its own website, and so does ACAP, acap.org. There are resources there as well for people who are involved in both clinical and education overall, that they can get more data that they need. So just additional resources are available.
Well, perfect. And again, thank you all so much for your time, and with everything coming on this morning, chatting, kind of bringing some perspective on the ELP, some of the issues, kind of the future, and kind of really, I think ultimately, like you said, this is just bringing awareness to a lot of these things. So I really appreciate your guys' time. And, if any of the listeners out there are listening or perhaps want to reach out to members of the ELP to maybe ask a question on maybe an issue that was talked about today, feel free to send them an email at academicservices@apta.org, which is also available in the show notes. But again, I want to say thank you again to our awesome panel of experts coming in today. I really appreciate your time, the service you guys are doing, and keep it up.
Thank you.
Access to healthcare is one of the largest issues facing both providers and patients, as millions of people worldwide lack timely and affordable access to healthcare. Anywhere Healthcare, a telehealth platform, is a simple, low-cost option for providers and patients that eliminates the barriers to access to all kinds of healthcare. To find out more, check out anywhere.healthcare, which is available in our show notes. And if you use the code HET in all caps when you email to sign up, you'll save 25% off the total cost. Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.